So good afternoon, everyone. It's really a pleasure to have here with us Dr. Jacqueline Adams. I'll read what her bio. Jacqueline Adams is a sociologist at the Center for Jewish Studies at the University of California at Berkeley. Her scholarship focuses on the ways in which people cope with persecution and undermine the government that oppresses them. She is conducting research on Jewish refugees' flight from France to Spain in the 1940s and on people who helped the refugees in both countries. Before beginning work on this topic, she studied Chilean women in Shantytowns and their experience of repression and impoverishment and coping strategies and resistance under the dictatorship of General Pinochet. She also examined their and other survivors' dissident art making and the development of a solidarity movement centered around smuggling and selling the art abroad. Her publications include Surviving Dictatorship, a work of visual sociology published by Routledge, and Art Against Dictatorship, Making and Exporting arpilleras. I hope you will show us what is arpilleras under Pinochet, published by the University of Texas Press. She was educated at the University of Cambridge and the University of Essex, where she earned a PhD in sociology. And Dr. Adams will speak about the challenges of conducting oral history interviews after dictatorship, refugees in Shantytown inhabitants of Pinochet's Chile. Thank you very much, and now the floor is yours.
So thank you very much, Margalit, and also for the team of the three of you, three institutions that got together for inviting me. And it's a pleasure to speak to you today about these data that I collected, 170 interviews. And I'm very delighted that you're interested to learn about this period, which is now the 1970s and 80s and in Latin America. So without further ado, I conducted, and I'm going to share my screen now, I conducted research. Are you able to see this?
No. Not yet.
Okay, sorry, one moment, please. Let's try again. Share screen. Okay, I apologize. Here we go. There we are. Do you see that?
Yes.
You can?
Yes.
Good. Now I can take it. And here we go. Okay. All good? So I conducted research with people involved in the movement that aimed, the political movement, the social movement, I should say, that aimed to end the Chilean dictatorship of General Augusto Pinochet. And this is a dictatorship that began in 1973 with a coup d'etat, and it ended in 1990. And I interviewed people who made and exported and sold dissident artworks, of which this is an example. And these artworks are called arpilleras. And I also interviewed other members of the pro-democracy movement, other members who were not arpilleristas, makers or sellers or exporters of arpilleras. Now, arpilleras are cafeteria tray-sized pictures in cloth, and they depict women, typically shantytown experiences of unemployment, poverty, meaning exacerbated poverty, and repression. But they also depict other people's experiences of repression. And very importantly, they depict women's collective efforts to resist. And so here's one about unemployment that shows the unemployment was a very big problem at the beginning of the dictatorship, and this shows how it affected people in many sectors of the economy. Here's another one about essentially a coping strategy, collective resistance effort, where you have women in the center with a soup kitchen that they've set up to feed local hungry children. But you also have the theme of unemployment on the right, both the top house and the bottom house, where you have a very frustrated woman. In each case, one of them is pregnant, asking her husband to look for work. The bottom one says, busca trabajo, look for work. And down below, you have a reference to shantytown poverty, meaning that they're lining up for water because there were no taps in the houses. And you also have the outdoor latrine because there were no latrines in the house, no toilets in the houses, and the presence of flies, and a woman washing because that was a form of micro-entrepreneurship, doing laundry, taking in laundry. Now, arpilleras became a symbol of the pro-democracy movement. And this is because they were made by over 1,000 women in shantytowns all around Santiago. They were made primarily by women who hadn't experienced a particular targeted act of government violence against them, but women who suffered the generalized repression that folks in shantytowns suffered, and who, as I said, were suffering extreme poverty, so even more impoverishment than what they already had. But arpilleras were also made with women and men political prisoners, with relatives of disappeared persons, with women in three small rural towns near Santiago, and they were made by Chilean refugees who fled Chile and went abroad. It's some refugees, a small minority. All the arpillera groups that I've just mentioned in Chile were clandestine groups because these were dissident images. They were images that people were afraid of making, so they did so in hiding. And groups met thanks to the helpful behaviors of some priests in shantytowns, not all priests, but some priests, many of whom, interestingly, were influenced by the liberation theology movement and were Europeans, many of them, not all, but a surprising proportion, allowed groups of women, and this is a group of arpilleristas is the word for arpillera makers, to meet in a rough-hewn building or in a proper room, attached to the church or in the garden of the church, in the church patio in the shantytown. When I use shantytown, these went from extremely basic constructed urban areas to places that were made of brick from the beginning, but were extremely impoverished. When I say made of brick, by a government program for the poor, for example. So this is a group going into its workshop meeting, and here they are inside. The woman at the end at the back was a researcher. This is in the 80s, and she was a friend of mine. But the others were local women, and they would sit and talk to each other and make arpilleras and discuss their problems and receive training through another institution called the Vicaría de la Solidaridad, which was a church humanitarian organization under the wing of the Catholic Church, which was the most important organization for the arpilleristas because it helped secretly smuggle out of the country their arpilleras to be able to then give them the money. And this is that institution. Here is the Vicaría de la Solidaridad. It's the upper floors of the fancy building, which is right next to the cathedral in the center of Santiago. The goals of the research, well, there were three sets of goals because there were three projects that I did. These interviews and the other forms of data collection I used my first project was my PhD dissertation aimed at understanding how the women who were in these groups changed in their thinking, in their awareness of human rights, in their political conception of themselves, in their awareness of rights as women, as a result of being in these groups. And a second project was became a book called Art Against Dictatorship. And there the goal was to learn about all phases of the arpillera, from the making in the workshops, from its origins, actually, to the smuggling out of the country, and to the remarkable transnational solidarity network that helped to sell these works and send the money back. And the goal was always to send the money back. The goal was not to earn a profit. And the third project was a book called Surviving Dictatorship, where I was interested in the women in the Shantytowns exclusively and their experiences, how they subjectively experienced impoverishment and repression, and also what they did about it, so their collective resistance. Now, the methodology which is relevant to this talk are mainly the 170 interviews that I conducted. So I conducted these with arpillera makers, the arpilleristas of the different kinds that I mentioned, with vicaria staff, so the folks who worked in this church institution, which was a major resistance, semi-clandestine resistance organization. It was part of the church because that's the only way that it could be protected from being shut down, because in its previous incarnation it was shut down before it became protected by the Catholic Church. So I interviewed vicaria staff, I interviewed the leaders of other small non-profit groups that sent arpilleras abroad in order to give the women who made them money. I interviewed refugees, Chilean refugees, but also Europeans who were in Europe and they were helping to sell arpilleras to send the money back. And I interviewed human rights and pro-democracy and feminist leaders in Chile. These are all leaders who were part of this pro-democracy movement. Interesting to know, because it's relevant for this talk, is that I did combine interviewing with other data gathering techniques, namely participant observation. So I was first there in 1995 for a year. Subsequently, my visits were just for interviews. While I was there for a year, I did ethnographic research while conducting interviews. And here's one group which was much reduced in size. The groups during the regime were 15 to 20 people, but when I was doing it, they were only 3, 4, 5, up to about 7. In this group, I was there every week, and in other groups every week when they met for 3 hours, one afternoon a week. I also did photo elicitation, meaning I showed groups photographs about their group's work, but also other groups' work. And I collected and analyzed ephemera, such as this flyer, which is a handbill, a little document that Shantytown residents, mainly women, well, I collected the ones mainly by women, would drop on the street for others to pick up and learn about protest events. I analyzed ephemera such as these. I analyzed photographs and textual documents in archives. So that's the archival part of the research. And I collected and photographed photos of every arpillera I came across, ending up with a huge database of photos of arpilleras. And I photographed them from collections in various different places, individuals' private collections, all of them, and shops. And here's an example of one of the arpilleras from a collection in France that I photographed. My oral history interviews focused on narrators, so their focus was the narrators' involvement with the arpillera groups, with the arpilleras at any stage, so making, smuggling out of the country, organizing groups, starting the arpilleras in the beginning, or selling them abroad. And the interviews with people who were not involved with arpilleras focused on their activism and on the conditions in Chile. This is just the back of an arpillera, so you can see that there was a message in the back sometimes. And that would be, this is an example of a message, which says, this lady is freedom and she's being beaten up or crushed by these 4 men who want to take away her basket with bread that she has for her children, the Chileans. So, of course, it's a hidden message. The four men are the junta, meaning the military leaders. Now, I'll launch into the talk now and stop sharing. So I experienced a number of challenges when interviewing people about what they had done during the dictatorship years. And several of these challenges, and these are the ones I'll focus on, were due to the dictatorship being very recent. So being just 5 years ago when I started the research, and then in a subsequent visit 15 years ago. But the focus today is on the 5 years ago interviews. What was it about the context that was significant? So why the recent dictatorship? Why does that matter? Well, it's important that you know a little bit about what people were experiencing. So in 1995, many whom I was interviewing, were very disappointed with how things were turning out under democracy. They had had high hopes for an improvement in terms of justice and in terms of economics, so getting better financially, their own poverty being reduced. A group of arpillera leaders felt that their financial situation hadn't improved, that they weren't being paid attention to, that they were being ignored, their contributions were not recognized. They and other refugees were very annoyed that Chile was referred to abroad as the Jaguar of Latin America, the economically successful country. Others felt indignant that violent repression was not being dealt with. There was no justice. And on the contrary, the government was at the time asking people to forget the past. I'm sorry, but I'm not sure you're seeing things. I'm seeing something which looks like a fern picture. Are you seeing things okay?
We see only you. You
okay.
stop sharing.
Okay. All right, good. Now it's okay. A Chilean refugee group in London thought that Chile was not really democratic. There was still a lot of unemployment. The cost of living was high. People were having a very difficult time, and there were still political prisoners. And many arpilleristas felt there might be another coup. So there was this looming anxiety of a possible another coup. Given this context, I'm going to start talking about recruitment, and then I'll talk about difficulties with the quality of the data. With recruitment, surprisingly, I did not have any difficulty recruiting individuals. This is despite their habit of years, of secrecy, because they had to be careful of hiding what they were doing. Just one or two interviewees told me that normally they were reluctant to give interviews. So one woman who was a leader in a Shantytown in the mothers group, it was called the Centro de Madres, the Mothers Center, which is a very active group trying to get infrastructure for the Shantytown. She said to me, and I'm going to read what she said, "There's another group of women in the Shantytown who do arpilleras, but they're very reluctant to talk about it now. There are many women who don't want to keep talking about things from then." And I said, "Why?" And Maria Antonieta said, "I don't know. I think they've closed up a bit. And also they felt very used sometimes, because people who come from abroad and who want to know your story and how everything is working, and these women, they don't really want this to go on. And I also am reluctant to go to interviews." And she said there was a woman from Belgium who was writing a book about organizations. And well, so because of that, we're a bit reluctant to share our experiences. And because these experiences were painful, and they really marked us in very painful moments in our history. And so we want to rub them out, to erase them. But there's always someone who comes and wants us to be reminded of them. So this is an expression of feeling used and painful memories. And yet, despite this, Maria Antonieta Parifeño and everyone else just about whom I interviewed did not hold back. They spoke fully and openly, and they granted me interviews, with the exception of a very small number whom I would have liked to have been interviewed by. I found that the central reason why in this kind of post-dictatorship context, one can still gain the access to interviewees and conduct interviews is that is because of one's positionality, because of who they perceive one to be. So aspects of who I was just happened to work in my favor. When I began the research, I was a PhD student, and I always told them I was doing it for my PhD. And so the student, the aspect of myself as a student was something that very many people were willing to help. They believed in education. They wanted their own daughters to receive an education. And because I was doing this for my studies, they were very willing to be interviewed. And I think that was the key aspect of my positionality that opened doors. But also the fact that I was young, I was somewhat vulnerable, I was there alone, I was a woman, made me less threatening. I also I have multiple citizenships and four, and I introduced myself with the country as being Swiss, because I grew up in Switzerland. I grew up in Geneva to British and Chilean parents, but if someone says, where are you from? For me, it's quite clear. I grew up in Geneva. I'm from Geneva. So Switzerland was outside Chile. And I think that when you're interviewing in a post-dictatorship context, being from abroad is a place that can help, because you're assumed to not have sides. You're assumed to not be of the right wing or of the left wing. You're assumed to have some distance. But of course, my political alignment was important. And they guessed that, even though I didn't say anything about it, they guessed that I was thoroughly sympathetic with the resistance movement, simply because I was studying arpilleras, which were the symbol of the movement. And another reason why it was so easy to recruit was that the interviews were about their connection with arpilleras, and arpilleras for all of them were the symbol of the movement, the resistance, and they were very important. And they were every aspect of the work with the arpilleras, everyone thought that they were doing important work, whether it was selling, whether it was trying to export them secretly, whether it was making them. So people were keen to talk about this work that they had found so important and so interesting. And that was another, probably the most important factor, along with being a student. So, of course, we also know as oral historians that our narrators have agendas. They have agendas. When you ask for an interview, they have agendas. And they had several agendas, which my work also fit with. And these included the hope that I might buy an arpillera. And because they had been in contact with foreigners, many arpilleristas, who had then subsequently put them in touch with someone who might buy an arpillera or themselves buy an arpillera. And at one group interview, they joked with me, "You're going to have to sell an arpillera," they said, as a way of sort of, just teasing me, because many people had in the past. But another agenda that many shared was they felt it was important. So one group in the eastern area of Santiago, one group of arpillerista group leaders said it was important to them that I tell people abroad that not all was well in Chile. So what I described about their disappointment with the dictatorship, they wanted people to know that. One said, you say in your country and other countries that things in Chile aren't as they should be. Now, relatives of disappeared persons, meaning dissidents who'd been kidnapped and never heard of again by the regime, relatives of the disappeared had done a great job already of spreading the message about their disappearances. They had done extremely impressive work, but they wanted me to continue to contribute. And so one woman, for example, mother of a disappeared, said to me during our interview, when I was talking about the arpillera, she stopped me short. And she said, but I didn't ask her about the disappearance of her son. And she was annoyed. And that was clearly because she wanted to tell me about this extremely important event in her life, and possibly because she wanted me to spread that message. We don't know. But certainly that was something that many others did want. Recruitment of interviewees was, so I've discussed the agenda, how the agendas also sometimes helped in terms of being able to recruit interviewees. Recruitment was slightly inhibited in the case of just a couple of narrators whom I asked, who were very well placed to, at the very start of my research, when I hadn't even gone into the field yet in one case, and when I'd just gone into the field, my first or second interview, they could have given me many contact details of people to contact because they were in touch with many arpilleristas and others related to the movement, but they didn't. And that could have been for a host of reasons, and it's totally understandable that they didn't know about me other than through our interview. And so there could be a host of reasons for that. But this reticence is certainly also partly to be explained by being wary. People had come from outside and betrayed them. Strangers were potentially, even in the post-dictatorship era, people didn't feel totally safe. So the post-dictatorship context made them, and rightly so, made them be careful. So in all these ways, the post-dictatorship context doesn't hinder recruitment, but can affect aspects of it. Now I'd like to talk about the quality of interview data and how this was affected by the context. Well, first I must say that the vast majority of narrators were very forthcoming with information to an extent that rereading my interviews now, I am actually astonished at how forthcoming they were. And I think they were forthcoming for the same reasons that they were willing to be recruited. I think those are the very reasons. However, there were times when data was of less good quality. And I'll just talk about that now briefly. So for example, some relatives of disappeared persons spoke at the start of our interviews as if they were telling a much rehearsed story, as if it was an official story. They sounded rehearsed. They sounded like they were telling me something they told many times before. They were trotting out a script, we can say. And I think they had told this story dozens of times before. So what we have with particular victims, or rather survivors, people who've been exposed to extreme repression, such as relatives of the disappeared, have been interviewed. We can expect that they will have been interviewed, or they would have told their story to other groups whom they wanted to, enlighten about the horrific things that were actually happening. Even during the dictatorship, they were telling groups in Shantytowns and groups in other towns, this is actually happening. It happened to me. So they've told their story many times before. And the result is a somewhat, perhaps a lacking in nuance narrative, and one that isn't spontaneous and often that doesn't go into details. But fortunately, this was just at the beginning of the interview. So here is an excerpt of my post-interview notes in London with the relative of a disappeared person, the mother of a disappeared person. I wrote, "At first, she was talking as if she was lecturing a group. Then over time, she became more spontaneous." And in the margin of these notes, I wrote, "Trying to impress me, not simply sincere." And in the notes immediately after the interview, I wrote a tone of boredom when she talked about los desaparecidos. So I was picking up on the fact that this was sort of a rehearsed script. And why did people do this? Not just because they'd been interviewed many, many times, but it is a feature of some people who've experienced some narratives in some oral history narratives, that with people who've experienced trauma, that their narratives sound rather flat and unemotional and distanced, and don't go into details and don't mention feelings. And that was certainly true for another interview, which I conducted with the wife of a very active resistance movement director in Washington, D.C., whose husband was Orlando Letelier, whose husband was the president and the founder of Chile Democrático and was blown up in Washington, D.C. by the Chilean secret police, essentially. And so there we really did see, I think, the effect of trauma, as well as having told her story many times, in that much of the description was matter of fact and devoid of any mention of emotion, despite it wasn't just the horrible incident, what happened to her husband. We were talking about quite the contrary. We were talking about her organizing arpillera exhibitions and making the world know about arpilleras in other ways. But nevertheless, until she talked about visiting an arpillera group in northern Santiago to buy their arpilleras, until that moment, the interview tone was probably indicative of trauma. Some narrators, so another issue with the quality of the data is that some narrators did not provide as much information as I would have preferred on specific topics. And this is to do again with the recent dictatorship. So firstly, some did not know things because the work they were doing was shrouded in secrecy, meaning the work at the time, the work under the dictatorship. So, for example, Noemi, a Chilean young woman who was a refugee in Holland and a member of the Chilean Communist Party, she couldn't tell me who had brought her arpilleras to sell in Holland, who had brought them. Because the true identity of these people who would come from Chile secretly carrying arpilleras was kept secret because, of course, what they were doing was dangerous. So they didn't want to divulge their identity. It was a case of the less you know, the better, to protect each other. And that was one reason why I couldn't learn, because she didn't know. Some people, some interviewees, just a small number, there were things where they simply didn't feel the need to elaborate or be specific because there was an assumption that I would understand, which wasn't necessarily the case. So, for example, I asked Emilia, whom I mentioned earlier, the mother of a disappeared man, what they would talk about in her arpillera group meetings. And she said, about all kinds of things, de todo un poco in Spanish. And I said, so I tried to probe, like what, for example? And she replied, well, about things related to the house, things that one might see in the streets. We talk about many things. And I said, and did you talk about the political situation or not? And she said, of course, yes. Now, it turns out from subsequent interviews that these talks about the political situation were crucial, but she was clearly somewhat vague, and my efforts to probe didn't really elicit that much information. Some narrate another reason for inability to access as much information as one would like is that some narrators, depending on the interviewer's positionality, where they're from, aspects of who they are, distorted information. And in my case, because I was European, and very understandably distorted information, not to be ill-willed in any way. So, for example, a Chilean woman who was working for the Vicaria and who also exported arpilleras secretly to a German non-profit separately from the Vicaria, started to tell me the truth about a Vicaria meeting. Sorry, beg your pardon, a Vicaria colleague, staff member, who told stories to Europeans. And she used the word sad stories to Europeans so that they would buy arpilleras. You know, in other words, but then, I beg your pardon, she corrected herself as she remembered that I was European. I was on the receiving end, possibly, although I wasn't the non-profits who were selling the arpilleras. And she stopped telling me things quite as truthfully as she had begun to. So she said, Winnie made herself responsible for writing to people abroad and for telling really sad stories to people abroad so that they would buy. And then she corrected herself and she said, I mean, to tell the story of, not the story, I'm translating from the Spanish right now, sorry, to tell about their financial situation, the social situation that people had who made the arpilleras, and also other people who made other things. So, this is simply because she was, having to be a little bit diplomatic and also protect the Vicaria. But there was another kind of slight distortion of the truth because I was a European, with an arpillera group leader who was ceased to be one in the present when I interviewed her. And Alicia told me that the groups in her area were making arpilleras, were meeting 3 times a week for 3 hours at a time. And that was to give the impression that there was a lot of arpillera making going on. This is right at the beginning of within 1 month of my arrival in Chile. And in fact, they only met once a week and some less than that. And many groups didn't have any orders for arpilleras for several weeks after I arrived. And that was because she saw me as a potential, someone who could put her in touch with a buyer, probably. And so, it was obviously, they're desperate. They were desperate to earn money to get some sales from the arpilleras. Another issue that I encountered with the quality of the data was some interviewers painting a rosier picture of things than actually existed, with tensions with regard to conflict, which is an inevitable part of any social movement, of course. And so back to Frida, the woman who also exported to Germany, but who worked for the Vicaria. She, for the Vicaria, conducted what they called quality control. So she looked at arpilleras, group leaders arpilleras, the arpilleras that group leaders brought in. So leaders of groups all over Santiago would bring arpilleras to the Vicaria to be exported, but there was quality control. And they would say, no, this one has to be done again. Look, there's this problem with it and that problem. And again, this is within my first month in Chile that I had this interview. So I didn't know that this was such a sensitive topic. But here's what she said. I said, when you worked with the women and did quality control, what was their reaction? How did they react to your quality control? And she said, the women, really well, really well. I always had a good relationship with the women. And I said, but for example, when you rejected an arpillera for reasons of quality, that would have hurt the woman. How did she feel? And I said, oh, okay, so there wasn't really a problem. No, Frida said, they didn't have a problem. And I said, did they complain about what you were doing? She said, well, many times they did complain. Many times they complained because you were showing them that certain things were not well done in their arpilleras, and they understood that you weren't just doing it arbitrarily. And there were times also, a couple of minutes later, beg your pardon, so ... there were times also when they had problems with us because we said to them, don't be don't put so much denunciation because we can't sell arpilleras that are this way. I mean, you can put these arpilleras for sale through other channels, but we cannot sell something with so much denunciation that is so cruel, so real, because people don't want to buy this. And they found, here now she's referring to the arpilleristas, they thought we were the limit. And they said, but that's what we think. This is what we're feeling. This is what's happening. So in other words, Frida, during this interview, was discussing a very tense moment. In fact, it turned out to be an extremely conflictual, not just for her, but this quality control. You have women desperate to sell their arpilleras and an institution that's imposing themes, subject matter, and corrections to people who desperately need the money right away. So they were very fraught. And so that perhaps explains why the truth was slightly distorted. There were times with data quality when I made mistakes that shut down the discussion. And these included my asking a sensitive question about political affiliation. So 3/4 of a way through an interview, I said to the sister of a disappeared man, were you a communist? I mean, lots had indicated already in her interview that she was, but I wanted to clarify. Her answer was, yes, why'd you ask? And that was pretty much the end of the interview. I would have liked it to have gone on. Another one I already mentioned. Emilia cut the interview short, essentially, or cut our discussion about arpilleras short. Emilia, the mother of a disappeared, because I wasn't asking about her son and the disappearance. And so this comes back to the point about being slightly rehearsed. Some narrators have an expectation that you'll ask them about a particular thing. And I avoided this thing, actually, because I knew how painful it was. And it wasn't the focus of the interview. The focus of the interviews for me were the arpilleras. But it turned out that doing this was a mistake because it was upsetting to them, because this thing was so important to them. So I've discussed problems with recruitment, and I've discussed problems with a little bit on quality of data. And so I'll end by discussing very briefly analysis and writing, and this very briefly, because there are really only 2 points. With analysis, a big problem with analyzing that I faced was that one of the things I was interested in was how this arpillera movement, because the arpilleras were the focus of a very effective resistance unit. I mean, this is a unit that didn't just bring money to the women. This is a unit that spread messages abroad about what was happening, that contributed to raising solidarity in people who bought arpilleras. And it was a unit where people, the literally over 1,000 women who were making arpilleras in Chile were also becoming radicalized and becoming actively involved in protests of many different kinds and lending support to other people in Shantytowns. Through their joining arpillera groups, a world of activism became part of what they were involved in. So arpillera, this book was not, the work was not, the arpilleras and my book are about far more than just artworks. It's about becoming political activists. And the problem was that the arpilleras had become the symbol of the resistance. So a problem I faced with analysis was that several people, about 8-10 people, described either themselves or someone they knew as the initiator of the arpilleras. You know, like it started in this group, or it started in our group, or we set it up through the Vicaria. And I knew I needed to get some approximation of accuracy about some approximation of how actually arpillera making got started. And it was very difficult because of that. The other problem with analysis was the veracity of some data, some information. So I had two middle class women whom I interviewed because they were directly involved in buying arpilleras and in setting up arpillera groups, 2 issues, and they both described the women who made arpilleras in the Shantytowns in a way that didn't align with the way that I perceived them from my interviews and subsequent participant observations. So as much more passive, there was the use of exaggeration, generalizing from what one woman said to what all said when discussing these women. And also there was a way of talking about these groups of women that suggested that stereotypes that exist in Chile about working class women were influencing what was being said, were influencing what the middle class narrator was telling me. So these were middle class narrations where what was said was not an accurate reflection or not entirely true, without any ill will on their part. So those are some of the issues I faced with recruitment, with quality of data, and with analysis. And I'll sum up by focusing on how dictatorship essentially a post-dictatorship context and recent dictatorship can affect conducting oral history. So interviewees, narrators have had painful experiences. They've been because of their recent dictatorship. In some cases, this resulted in them being much visited. by interviewers, by students, but also by politicians, and by sometimes being let down by visitors. And this can cause in some reluctance to be interviewed, but nevertheless, agreeing to interviews and being very generous with the information that they provided. The researcher's positionality is central to their response, as also are the narrator's own agendas. The wariness that they've developed over years, however, may contribute to preventing them from giving contact details of other potential interviewees. So that's for recruitment. Regarding the effect of dictatorship on data quality, to sum up, data quality, in my experience, was not negatively impacted in the vast majority of cases. On the contrary, I found the interviews remarkably long, detailed, informative, and rich. In a few cases, though, very small, what sounded like a much rehearsed story was given by survivors, because survivors of dictatorship are often called on to tell their story by different parties. Some groups have a designated speaker, someone who, when they're visited, tends to speak for them. Some narrators cannot or will not provide as much information as the oral history interviewer desires for various reasons related to the recent dictatorship, and some distort information out of no ill will. There are sensitive issues, finally, connected with political affiliation, connected with tense relations between groups that come into contact with each other. And this can also lead to stopping the interview. So I'll stop there. And thank you very much for your attention. I'm mindful of the time.
Thank you very much. It was really fascinating talk, and I'm sure that there are many questions. Maybe we will start with Shmuel Yerushalmi, who wanted to ask. I suggest that, each one will ask one question and you will answer immediately, not to collect questions. I don't see the faces. Maybe I should try.
Yeah, I hear.
Okay, someone.
Are you going to ask?
Yes.
Okay. I want to ask you next question. What exactly was the relation of local population in Western countries of Western Europe, United States of America, to refugees from Chile in the epoch of Pinochet? And another question, is it population of Western countries demonstrated any solidarity with refugees from Chile in this period?
Okay, thank you very much for your questions. So the relationship with if I understood the first part, it was about the relationship of Europeans, for example, with the refugees. I'd say they were very mixed response to the refugees, but what was very notable and salient in my research was the tremendous solidarity of groups who were already left-leaning. So groups in Europe who were left-leaning, who were involved in humanitarian activities through their own activism previously, or who were in human rights organizations such as Amnesty, such as other, in some cases, Christian church leftists who were in human rights work. These folks were very, very supportive of the refugees. And one of the ways in which they were supportive, and one of the reasons, let's say, is because they were leftists for the most part, who had followed with great interest what had happened to President Salvador Allende, who was the Chilean socialist president who was overthrown. He was democratically elected, he was a Marxist, and he was overthrown by the dictatorship. So there was, in Europe, the ground was fertile, was very fertile for solidarity, because there were many leftists who had followed with interest the Allende's efforts to, through constitutional means, bring about socialism in Chile. And they were very distressed by the dictatorship. So when refugees arrived from Chile, and when these human rights activists got to work to help them, but also to help people in Chile by actually writing to Chile and asking the Vicaria to send them arpilleras to sell. So there was a huge solidarity effort in many European countries. France was a particularly solidarity-oriented country. And interestingly, many of these people were the same people who had suffered or helped Jews during the Holocaust. And subsequently, many of these same people were involved in other humanitarian efforts. There was, in the 1970s, at the same time as the arpilleras were being sold, there was a sort of aid to developing countries, as they were then called, movement. And these folks were also involved in this. I hope that answers your question.
We'll turn now to Dov. Please open the microphone.
Thank you. Yes. Okay. First of all, thank you. It's wonderful what you told us. I have one question about your work and one question about my work. The first question about your work is how much, if at any, was the influence of Paulo Freire, the Brazilian pedagogist and revolutionary, on what happened in Chile and what people did in Chile during the resistance and after that? This is the question. And also in that matter, from your experience, what part of Jews are involved in the different kind of objection, resistance, and activism against Pinochet? And
thank you.
The second question is about what I'm doing, maybe after you answer.
Thank you very much. Yes, I got those down. The influence of Paulo Freire was quite significant, I would say, because one of Paulo Freire's ideas was popular education, so grassroots education. That was his central tenet. And there was a very large amount within the resistance movement of efforts to go into shantytowns and set up popular education groups. And this was directly seen in my own work with the arpilleristas, for example, where non-profits, underground non-profits who were involved in the resistance, sometimes arranged for speakers, for someone who knew about a certain topic, such as inequality faced by people in society, human rights violations, but also women's rights, human rights. What does this mean? These non-profits, these underground human rights, humanitarian resistance organizations would look for groups to educate on these matters. And, well, there were a great way of finding a group was to approach a shantytown priest, and because that's where people congregated and were allowed to congregate. And the priest, of course, could refer them to the arpillera groups, but also to other groups. So there was a huge amount of consciousness raising about these issues, particularly about human rights. But also there were efforts like alphabetization, meaning literacy, efforts to teach literacy. And interestingly, many of these influenced by Paulo Freire were efforts that were hidden, in the sense that the shantytown the organizers would organize a poetry contest. Sounds innocuous, right? Poetry contest. But of course, the poetry contest was the occasion for starting to encourage discussion about human rights. Or they'd organize there was a woman's music festival. And that would again be a peña. It was called a peña, where there were women who would play and sing. So there were all kinds of clandestine educational efforts at the grassroots that were done influenced, I think, very much by Paulo Freire. Your second question regarding the part of Jews in all kinds of resistance. And I think Jews were very involved in resistance in Chile, because Jews in Chile, many of them were of the left, and some were involved in resistance movements, because the resistance world in Chile was a world of leftists of different persuasions, or people who weren't yet leftists, but just by wanting to oppose the dictatorship, learned ideas and began to think in ways that we would associate with aspects of what we might think of as being leftist. And there were very many, some of the disappeared, who were obviously leftist political activists, were Jews, and there were members of the Vicaria who were Jews, because originally the Vicaria, before it was shut down, so the earliest incarnation was 1974, an ecumenical organization that included the Jewish community. The rabbi of Santiago was part of it, as were Protestant groups and the Catholic Church. And this was shut down by Pinochet because of the work it was doing in 1976. And then it went to the Catholic Church. But in its ecumenical incarnation, yes, they were contributing, the Jewish community and its leaders were contributing with funding, with ideas, with strategies, and with concrete efforts to help the very earliest persecuted victims.
Yeah. And if I want to ask about the work I'm doing, I'm now active in Jaffa, near Tel Aviv, working with about 1,500 families of Palestinians living in Jaffa who have orders to leave their houses from Tel Aviv municipality. So we want to organize some kind of activism, including photograph of the families and also documenting orally the histories of the families. So this project that I'm now involved in, one question is there any value of making oral interviews in Hebrew, because I don't speak Arabic, but they do speak Hebrew? Is it valuable? And second, would you suggest to me that a parallel to what I'm doing as oral history would be to put a video camera and film all that in video? This is my question about my work. Thank you.
Okay, yeah. I think that it depends on, the answer I think is it depends on how well they speak Hebrew, because you will certainly lose a lot unless they're absolutely fluent. My view personally is that it's better to have people express themselves regarding what you're interested in the language in which they can do it best. So I think it's preferable for the interviewer to have the language problem and require an interpreter who you would have to train and tell about your research, etc., and the need to not change anything in what you say. That's preferable to having the interviewee speak a language that's not theirs. As for videoing, I think in terms of creating a body of testimonies that can be used for research or for other purposes, in my view, it's preferable to have a video camera, but in the right circumstances, so in the right kind of place. And, you know, with a video camera, you can make people forget about it. But a video camera is a little bit more obtrusive. It would have to be someone else managing the video camera, not the interviewer, is more intrusive, than a small digital voice recording device. But it is possible with a good interviewer, if you interview in such a way that you really create good rapport, certainly you can have them forget about the video camera. Of course, you also need to ensure that conditions are ideal, quiet, etc. I hope that helps a little.
Ella, thank you very much.
So maybe I will take...
May I ask a question?
Yes.
אני יכולה לדבר? Yeah, I would like to ask, really, I would like to thank you. It was really very, very interesting and very thoughtful to see all the aspects that you raised. But what is interesting to me, did you ask the women from the shanty places, that you interviewed about their life in general, or you were very much focused on their artwork, on what they wanted from it, and not really to look at a more general picture of the life of these women and how it brought them to where it brought them in this resistance movement?
Yes, I was interested in the life of the women because I was interested in how they changed and therefore what their lives were like and what it was about being involved in the groups that made them change. And so in the interviews, I also asked them many things about their experiences beyond this, but especially during participant observation. So I was for a year with just some of the women, so a very small number of the women, when I was conducting participant observation, that was also a very good way for me to learn about the Shantytown environment, because I went in there once a week, what it was like what the problems they were faced with were, because the conversations during the workshops, and especially going to the bus stop afterwards, as they walked with me to the bus stop because it was dangerous, they would tell me things about their lives, about just, small things would slip out that made me understand more fully. So, for example, one woman who accompanied me to the bus stop said, yes, I have to stay in the house. I have to guard the house. And I said, what do you mean you have to guard the house? And she said, oh, yes, because we have to guard our houses. Otherwise, there are burglars who can come in. And she said, you see these fences here? So those are good fences. With those fences, you're safer. But in my house, we just have a wooden fence. So you see, the kinds of details were ways of learning about their life, which I think were crucial. So for me, the combination of participant observation with interviews was certainly of benefit because I was able to learn much more. And then with regard to your question specifically about the interviews, so at the end of my first book, meaning in order of my finishing it, was the one on the arpilleras, the one that focused on the arpilleras and its making and exporting and etc. But I had so much of my interviews with women in shantytowns that I hadn't used, precisely what you're asking about. That is why I wrote my second book, which ended up being the first to be published. But my second book was the second one I wrote on surviving dictatorship, was because I had all this information about their lives and their specifically their experiences of poverty, of repression, and of resistance, meaning of coping with poverty and of coping with state violence. And so I kind of didn't want to lose this. And I still feel that there's so much that I have not used.
And did you ask them about their childhood, about their parents, about their education?
So I wish I had. I have a little on that, but that wasn't at all what I focused on. And that would have been much better to do. Yeah. And I think that would have been what I should have done.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you very much.
Sharon?
Yes, thank you for this very interesting talk. That also the point of view of the interviewer and the interviewee, it was very, very important, and thank you for that. I wanted to make one comment about the answer you gave, Dov, about the language, and I totally agree with you that the language is very important. That both the interviewer and the interviewer will speak the same language, but it's also, if your aim, for example, though, is to give the Jewish population the point of view of the Arabs, so it's also important sometimes that it will be in Hebrew if their Hebrew is good enough. But I wanted to ask you, Jacqueline, about if you have parallel projects in different countries, because all this of women art as act of resistance and an act of power, and to give the women a voice. So it's in a lot of countries we can find. Only in Israel I can say we can maybe count the Bedouinian women and the asylum seekers, that they have same groups. It's not dictatorship and it's not exactly resistance, but it's also parallel. Like it makes, I think we can find similarities in those groups. So is there any project that makes this projects, put them together and try to see the similarities and the differences?
So, yeah, there's certainly, you're absolutely right. There are many groups that are involved in needlework, which ends up being resistant. And I am not doing work to compare or with other groups, because now I'm working on Jewish refugees from the Holocaust. So another condition of state violence, not just state violence, widespread transnational violence. And so I myself am not working on that. But there is a book that you might enjoy by a colleague here at Berkeley. And the book's called Fray, F-R-A-Y. And it is about various needlework-based, not so much groups, in some cases individuals, but essentially forms of resistance. And I encourage you to do something like that if you're interested in, because I really do think it's so fruitful. You know, these are small groups of women that are doing actually tremendously important work, both for themselves and often for consciousness raising, and often for their communities and beyond their communities. And so I think it's a comparative study would be very good.
Okay, Shani.
Yeah, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Well, I wanted to ask you a question about, I can hear myself not good. I wanted to ask you a question about the language that the survivors, the people, the women were using, because you noted several times about the short or the not specific testimonies and the interviews, that there were little of words. And I wanted to know if there was any effort to look at that text and that interviews as a language of trauma, because you did refer to them as a war-affected population.
Yeah, that's right. So yes. So in fact, I had a whole paragraph on this for my talk, which I cut out because I wanted to tell you folks the less obvious. You know that oral history interviews are affected by trauma. You already all know that. But yes, certainly, I'm going to tell you what I said now. I'm just looking for it. So okay, let me just speak. So an example I didn't give you, which I could have given you, is I was doing a group interview with relatives of the disappeared, and there was one spokesperson who had a lot of contact with foreigners, and she spoke for the first 15 minutes, basically, although it was a group interview. And I was thinking, how can I get others to join in? Because you lose something when you have just one speaker. And so slowly, others began to chip in. And one of the ones who did was a mother of a disappeared man she was called Doris. And she spoke in about what's equivalent to eight lines of transcription about what had happened, but very in a way that was very not to use a negative term, but in a way that was, I was going to say, incoherent, so difficult to understand for an outsider, very difficult to understand what she meant. It wasn't clear exactly what event she was talking about, who she was referring to in this sentence. There was a lack of specificity. There was no detail. There were names who were omitted. She was talking to me, but one would have to really know her story to understand. And I just arrived. There was no way I could know her story. And so this was, I think, an example of trauma. Of course, she would have told her story many times before, But perhaps in the context of a brand new interviewer, someone she'd never met before, in a group context where she didn't know me, so she didn't trust me, brought out anxieties about, which added to the difficulty of giving a coherent narrative, as it does with anyone. What was fortunate was that things worked out very fortunately for me by accident, in that I was there for a year conducting fieldwork. And during that year, I was with the different groups for one day a week, one day for a few hours that day every week. And this group was one of them. The relatives of the disappeared had a song group that used to be the arpillera group, but the arpillera group no longer existed. So the same members were in the song group. And so I was with them for months. By the time I asked for the first interview, I only asked for the first interviews beginning about 5 months later. Now, the reason for that was I was too afraid of asking for the interview. That was the real reason. Because of this role problem, so as a participant observer, I had become a member, not a real member, but a quasi-member of the group. I developed ties of affection. These women treated me as their niece. They were like my aunties. They were, it was a friendly relationship. I mean, they knew I was there as a foreigner. They knew I was writing a thesis on this, but there was this. So to suddenly go from being a quasi-group member and certainly a friend, helping in every way I could, to switching and saying, could I please interview you, was a role shift that was too difficult for me. It was too awkward to make that shift. It seemed really betraying them to do that, because it was as if I was saying, I'm actually here to study you. And so for that reason, I just couldn't do it for months and months. I couldn't do it. But in fact, therefore, by accident, it was exactly the right thing to do, because over the months, they built up trust. As I say, this wasn't my intention, but over the months, it was just the right strategy, although it wasn't a strategy. It was just the right thing to have happened, because they knew me so well that by the time I did ask for an interview with Doris and with all the others, she was completely open with me. And what I've just described, although it was still traumatic, she was still thoroughly traumatized, but she was able to speak with me in a way that was, very, very open, and for me, very understandable in that spoke clearly. But also, you asked about trauma. Of course, there were tears. There were tears. One interviewee, one narrator did stop, and she said, I have the quote here. No, I cut it out because I thought it was too obvious to you all. But she suddenly stopped the interview, and she said, she was talking about something not directly related to her disappeared son, actually. And she suddenly stopped and said, it hurts me to do these things, to do the interview. And I said, well, don't tell them to me then. No, she said, me duele contar estas cosas. It hurts me to tell these things. And I said, don't tell them to me then. And she, actually, I'm moved just telling you about it. And we had a pause, and then she said, no, it does me good to tell these things. It also does you good. So they have this idea, which I myself am very doubtful about whether it does good. But that was clearly another manifestation of trauma. There were another interview with a daughter of a disappeared where also she cried.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
I will take I would like to ask also something. What are you doing with the interviews? I mean, are they deposited somewhere in an archive for general use? Also, something about the questions, the methodology of the questions. You spoke about rehearsed stories. Now, when you ask questions, you actually can break the rehearsal. So I see from what you quoted that you asked many questions. So if you can elaborate a little bit on the methodology of asking. And another small question: Who was drawing the pictures for the arpilleras? I mean, the women were involved in drawing the pictures, or
yes. Okay, so thank you. I'm right now in contact with. I've just been writing to the Chile in Santiago. There's a Museo de los Derechos Humanos, and I'm in contact with the archivist there. There is more than one, but one of them. And I would like the cassettes, because they're cassettes, to be deposited there. I've tried the Bancroft Library, which is our UC Berkeley, University of California at Berkeley archive, and they don't want them. I'm trying to find a home, and I want them digitized right away, because they have to be. When I'm rereading them, thanks to your request that I give this talk, it's all the more pressing. And this is really given me the incentive to try again, because I have tried previously and get these accepted by somewhere. But I'm fussy. I want them to be digitized, and I want them to be made very rapidly accessible. So not just anywhere. Secondly, your question about asking questions to break the rehearsed story. Yes. Well, yes, of course I did. So the story, interestingly, I do remember, for example, with the group interview with the agrupación, that even the questions were eliciting rehearsed responses initially, you see. Also bear in mind, I just arrived. This was, again, within my first month. And I wasn't that experienced an interviewer. But in this case, even the questions had already had an answer. But then why did they start chipping in only after about 15 minutes? I think it was because they were also observing me. They hadn't met me before. They didn't know who I was. And they were trying to figure me out. Is this someone we can fully trust? Do we want to help this person? And they began to feel more comfortable. Also, I was a stranger. They weren't going to behave as if I wasn't there and be totally relaxed. But there are questions. So I'll give you another example of of questions that did elicit the right kind of what I wanted. There was an interview again at the very beginning with a group of leaders of arpillera groups from the eastern area of Santiago. And the first 15 minutes after my arrival, first they were quiet, and then they started to tell me about how bad their situation was. And there was an outpouring of enraged sentiment about how bad their situation was, how they were not neglected, they were neglected, they were not recognized, they were still poor. They were very unhappy with the democracy. Their expectations had not been met. And this outpouring went on for about 15 minutes. And although I was certainly interested in the context, and it was very helpful to know, A, what they were feeling now, and B, what their expectations had been during dictatorship, although that was certainly valuable, I did want to talk mainly about the arpilleras. So there was one fortunate question, which it did occur to me to ask, which got them out of that. Now, this wasn't at all rehearsed, Margalit, so it's a bit difficult for your question, but it's kind of along the same lines. First of all, the thing I did was I listened. I just listened and listened and nodded. And I was interested, of course, and I showed it. But then I said, all this that you're telling me, did you tell it in your arpilleras? So, somehow sort of taking what they're saying and turning it around and bringing it to the topic that you would rather they talk about. I think perhaps, in the rehearsed context might also work. And then lastly, about the pictures. So the women would draw the pictures, but they would cut out the cloth directly rather than draw it first. But it was very much shaped, the content, by what they were asked for, increasingly so as the regime went on, meaning that I've written an article about this called When Art Loses Its Sting. So initially it was the personal expression of the women's experiences with a lot more leeway, although there was some directed arpillera making about human rights articles in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But it did become, after a while, there were certain themes that they were asked for, and they were expected to do them in certain ways that were dictated by the Vicaria. Or it was an interesting dialectic where one woman might initiate a change, initiate a different way of depicting something or a different topic, and the Vicaria might say, oh, we really like that, and impose it on other groups. So increasingly over time, like we're talking though in the mid-80s, so, after 10 years of dictatorship, the Vicaria was saying, do X themes and correcting them when they didn't do them in the way that they would like. So that is what the article is about, actually. It's about this change. The commodification, not for money gaining purposes, but the sort of standardization of the arpillera making.
Margaret, יש זמן לעוד שאלה?
There are two other people, Chaim and Eti, and this will be the end. But make it short, Chaim, please.
Yes, very short. I will. You talk about the Catholic Church, that they support the arpilleras all the way up. I wonder if you have a chance to speak or to interview any of those priests and to understand how and why they went against the way the Catholic Church used to be attached to not left the people in Chile.
Yeah, and that was a big mistake I made, where I didn't interview the priest, and that was an obvious one. But one of the reasons I didn't interview the priest, the main reason was a mistake. I didn't realize that it was so important to do that. That was the real reason. But actually, in fact, many of these priests had left. So the priest I showed you the participant observation that I did with this group of arpilleristas who were sitting around a table. Remember one of the photos? Yeah. That was in Santa Adriana, a shantytown in the south of Santiago. Their priest was from Spain, and he'd left. He'd gone back to Spain. In another shantytown in the north, where I interviewed a group leader, their priest was from Ireland. He was very helpful. He'd gone back to Ireland. In La Victoria, their priest was from France. They had two, actually, and they had both, one after the other, gone back to France. And now it isn't that all priests were foreign, but it was remarkable how many were. And so I started to read about liberation theology in Chile to try and understand this phenomenon. And because, you're absolutely right. The church had this dual position. The church in Chile, the Catholic Church, capital C, there was Cardinal Raúl Silva Enriquez, was the Cardinal of Santiago, and he was very much supporting humanitarian efforts and human rights efforts. And in fact, he's responsible for the Vicaria. But there were bishops and there were other higher-ups and many priests who were against this. And in fact, there were priests in shantytowns, a few, who said to the women that they couldn't. One woman in the eastern part of Santiago said, our local priest won't let us meet because he thinks that we're going to try and radicalize people, politicize people. And there was, even within the Vicaria itself, there was a vicario, meaning a regional head, who weren't happy with the relatives of the disappeared, because he thought that if they met with shantytown women, they would try and influence them politically. So, even in these local communities of impoverished neighborhoods, there were priests who weren't supportive, but very many were Chileans, and a large number of non-Chileans. So I asked a bishop post-regime, why were there so many of these foreigners in the shantytowns? I mean, what on earth was happening that there were all these European priests in shantytowns? And he said, because you see, they would come and wanting to do some work in Chile, and we thought that the middle-class neighborhoods were just like their middle-class neighborhoods. So we thought we'd send them to where they could learn about where they could be in the Chilean reality, he said to me. And this was a conservative bishop. And he was telling the truth. He was actually a relative of mine, a distant relative. And so it was back to your question. Yeah. Okay. So why were they, your question was, why were they against the way the Catholic Church was? I think essentially it was an influence of liberation theology. I think that was it. And these priests were foreigners, and they had learned about the Allende effort to bring through constitutional reform, to bring socialist reform to Chile, and they were probably sympathetic. And so that would have been part of it. They had an outsider's perspective. They weren't caught in this, Chile was highly politicized under Allende already. The right hated the left hated the right. And of course, this became even more vicious under Pinochet.
Okay.
What is Shantytowns? Can you explain what is Shantytowns?
We are running behind time, and the only question I have now is for Eti, and I hope, please make it short because we have to finish. Eti,
yes. Thanks. I hope it will be very short. It goes back to your response to one of the other earlier questions about the ethics of the interviews. You said that you built trust, and then somebody started crying, and you said, "Don't tell me," and so on. But you also said that they came with an agenda, and I'm sure that you built an agenda as you progressed in your research. And what happens when you have an agenda, or when you see something that the interviewee doesn't see, and you want to be faithful to your academic integrity, and it might clash with that person's view of things, and I mean it's under the realm of the ethical, but I think it's very, very important. So,
yeah. Okay. Thank you. Well, first of all, I think in oral history research, both the narrator and the interviewer have agendas, possibly more than one agenda. So there's no avoiding that. And you have an agenda at the beginning of your research, and it might change slightly in the course of the research. And they might have several agendas. And I think the key is if I'm understanding your question correctly, is to listen to what they want to tell you. So, we have an agenda. And of course, I was mainly interested in their development through being in an arpillera group. So I was interested in that's with the women. So, I was interested in things A, B, and C. But if they wanted to tell me about D and E, I would let them tell me about D and E first in an ideal world. I didn't always do this right. As I told you, that example where this woman cut me short, Emilia, and said, "You didn't ask me about the disappearance." This is, after the interview had gone on. But in an ideal world, to do things correctly, listen to what they want to tell you. For a start, you don't know whether that's going to end up being extremely helpful in the end to you. You might not think it is now. But then you can draw them back to your topic. And then I don't think we want to do anything unethical under any conditions. If what we want from our agenda is hurtful to them to such an extent that they do not want to continue, of course we have to stop immediately. I mean, there was no question to me that, that we would stop if that's what she wanted or anyone wanted. You have to do that. So those are my perspectives. I hope I've understood correctly what you were asking.
Yeah, I was talking about clash in perspectives, actually, more than agendas, and what happens if you realize that the person's perspective is not quite what you see. You get the entire picture, and they are only seeing one angle, and what happens when there's clash.
Okay.
And you don't want to offend, of course, or to cause anyone,
Yeah. Well, I think our job is to listen. If that's problematic, I mean, our job is to see their world from their perspective. That's what we want to do. So if their perspective is very narrow and they say something we know to be wrong, that nevertheless is their reality. And I don't think we can correct them during the interview. I think we want to get
during, of course not. But what do you do in the final?
Well, I think we have to stop now. I'm sorry. I'm sorry if we are really.
Please write to me, and we'll talk about it.
Jacqueline, thank you so much. It was really so interesting, and I'm glad we invited you. And
thank you.
It's, I'm sorry that I have to stop here, but I hope we will have more opportunities to continue now we have to look for the books.
Well, thank you very, very much for having invited me. As you can see, I've enjoyed engaging with you and indeed learning from your questions more than you have from me, no doubt. So it's been a wonderful experience. And thank you for your attention and interest. And I invite anyone to please write to me. So I'm going to the University of Salamanca now, so you can use my Gmail for now. I mean, I'm at Berkeley still, but only for another few weeks. So you can write to me at jackie.adams, which is jacquie.adams@gmail.com. And I'll be on my Berkeley email address probably for another month and a half to 2 months. And then I'll have a new one, which I don't know yet, at Salamanca. Thank you very much again.
Thank you.
Good luck in Salamanca and a Happy New Year. And thanks again.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Bye-bye then. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thanks so much.